أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. يا أيها الذين آمنوا اتقوا الله.
Assalamu alaikum. Good morning, Bula Vinaka, ladies and gentlemen. It gives me much pleasure to be here this morning. I'd like to firstly, of course, acknowledge some of the key speakers this morning. Our guest from USA, Sheikh Mahmoud. Pleasure listening to you. I'd like to acknowledge the acting president of Fiji Muslim League, the various officials of Fiji Muslim League, the heads of the various missions, the excellencies, members of the diplomatic corps who are here, all the other invited guests, members of different agencies and entities that are here present this morning. One of the advantages of being the last speaker is that all the wise people have always spoken before you. You don't actually have to speak for a very long time. But I'd like to acknowledge all of the speakers this morning, and all of them have actually spoken about the virtues, not just about Islam itself, but about the virtues of Prophet Muhammad Rasul Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, whose birth we actually celebrate today. Many of them have spoken about what were the conditions that led or that surrounded before his birth, what happened after his birth, what happened to him as a young person, as a teenager, as a grown person, and the trials and tribulations that he went through. We know many of these stories. We've been told these stories on a number of occasions. And as I've said on previous occasions also, such occasions are an opportunity for us to not only celebrate the birth of the Prophet, but also to be able to carry out a self-reflection of where we are. As the Sheikh had mentioned earlier on, he was indeed a symbol of humanity, of charity, of empathy, indeed patience. All of those qualities are aspects of a human being that we need to emulate, we need to copy, we need to be like, because we follow what he taught us. Indeed, if you look at what he taught the Arabs actually were very, very tribal. Everybody knows that before the advent of Islam. Tribes would fight each other. If somebody was killed for one tribe, that battle would continue for years. They were very revengeful. In the same way that the Imam from Ba had mentioned, that many of these aspects of the Arab period or the Jahiliyyah period or the age of ignorance was so insurmountable that you had this man who came in and completely changed it overnight. The fact that you had, for example, women or young girls being buried by their parents, which was a tradition. It was a tradition that was held for centuries, for hundreds of years. They would do that, because the female had actually no value. If I belonged to a particular tribe and I married a woman from another tribe, the moment she married me and came to my tribe, she lost her status in her tribe. And then if I left her, as they did, then she would also have no status in my tribe. So she was basically left nowhere. So concept of things like maher, where if you marry somebody, you give a particular asset, you give money, that is hers. And she has to accept the maher amount. We have to understand why this started. It started as a result of what used to happen in Arabia before. There was no Saudi Arabia then. Saudi Arabia is just a new creation. It was Arabia. And to come in that midst And to completely change that was actually a true revolution. It was challenging the status quo. So, to get back to my original point, that we as Muslims, as brothers and sisters in humanity, need to look at how the Prophet lived his life. And we need to be able to emulate that at a very practical level. We talked about him being charitable, about how he understood the concept that when we are born, we come with nothing. When we die, we go with nothing. Muslims aren't buried with fancy clothes or jewelries and watches. You don't take your cars with you in the grave. You are simply bathed, you are washed, you're wrapped in a white cloth and you go into your grave. So you come with nothing, you go with nothing. The only thing you take with you is obviously your belief and your deeds. Your deeds. What did you do when you were alive? How did you treat other people? Did you beat up your wives? Did you beat up your children? Did you care, as the Sheikh mentioned, about your neighbor? Today we don't even know our neighbor's name. And Muslims are taught that you must not eat until your neighbor has eaten. How many of us actually are practicing that in real terms? It's easy to say things, but are we actually practicing it? These are very fundamental issues. When you go to the bathroom at the masjid, do you leave it clean for the person who's going to come after you? We are taught that the Prophet said when you're walking on the street, if you see something sharp, if you see an object that may hurt the person walking behind you, it's your responsibility to pick it up and put it on the side. It's an act of worship. It's a deed that you must carry out because it is your responsibility. How many of us are actually doing that? So again, these occasions are for us to be able to self-reflect. And using this person that was sent by God to be an example to the whole of humanity. As Hazrat Ali had mentioned, and I mentioned this a couple of weeks ago, that he said, I have brothers in faith, meaning sisters also, brothers and sisters in faith, and brothers and sisters in humanity. In other words, every fellow human being of yours is a fellow brother or sister. We must treat everybody with equality. We must treat everybody with respect. The Sheikh also mentioned about who first breastfed the Prophet. How many of us do know that the first adhan that we give today was in fact given by Bilal? There's a masjid on the way to Ba called Bilal Masjid. And who was Bilal? Bilal was an African slave, black African slave. Today, when we have our interactions, even some people amongst Muslims say, it's a fact. He's too dark. Let's not get married to that person. We are looking at outward appearances as opposed to looking at the inward appearances. Many parents will say nowadays, nahi bahut sour hai. It does not matter. When you die, it won't matter how fair you were, how dark you were. What matters is what your deeds were like. How did you treat people when you're on planet Earth? These are very fundamental issues. Also was mentioned to us that the Prophet's first wife was in fact somebody who was married to somebody else before. She was a widow. She was about 15 years senior to him. He was 25 years old and she was 40 years old. And all his children came from her. How are we applying that in our day-to-day lives? How are we judging people? Before we judge anybody, we must firstly use the Prophet's life as a reference. What would he have done? What did he do? And then use that as knowledge, as ilm, to then be able to carry out your responsibilities, to be able to then judge people. In the days when wars used to take place between different parties or different groups or different nations, they used to have what they call war captives, prisoners. So if the other side lost, the people who were fighting for them, you actually held them captive. And the Prophet said that those captives who can teach Muslims to read and write, I'll free you. It was completely unheard of. Completely unheard of. That you'll free war captives just because they can teach somebody to read and write. Which meant he placed so much emphasis on knowledge. It's a very famous saying. He said, seek knowledge even if you have to go to China. In those days, going to China was a big deal. So again, how much emphasis are we placing on knowledge? How many of us read ourselves? How many of us seek to read ourselves? How many of us place emphasis on educating our children? He was also somebody who never raised his voice. He never yelled at his wives. He never yelled at his children. He spoke to people with so much gentleness, so much compassion. Are we doing that in our lives? Nowadays, if somebody gives a very loud speech or sermon, you think, oh, bahut julum phala hai. But we need to have that love and affection. Islam means peace. With peace comes affection. With peace comes love. So these are very fundamental issues that we need to be able to think ourselves and be able to apply that. In the same way, and I really admired what the Sheikh said about how the Prophet did not have a father, so he could say Rabbi, and how he did not, or he had a mother but who died at a very young age, when he was very young, so he could have ummati. So the ummah obviously is about people who believe in God. And if people who believe in God means that we have a higher calling. It means that we need to treat people also alike. So modern day concepts like racial discrimination, we should not be racially conscious. We should not racially discriminate against people. In fact, Muslims should be at the forefront of ensuring and indeed standing up to racial discrimination. They should be at the forefront of that. You should be at the forefront of things like climate change. The Prophet said when they used to go to war, don't kill or attack people who are non-combatants. In other words, people who are not fighting, women and children, don't attack them. Don't kill them. Don't cut down trees. A very famous saying of his, when you go to war, don't cut down trees. In those days, he talked about the environment. How many of us are conscious about the environment today? Do we keep our environment clean? Do we simply throw the twisties packet outside the car? Because as our Imam said from Ba Masjid, that it is your character, it is your mannerisms that people look at. How you conduct yourselves, who you hang out with, who are your friends, is how generally people will judge you. We are told that when people work for you, you should pay them before the sweat dries up. When you make a transaction, it's written in the Quran that you must write down a contract, written contract, even between parties who agree with each other, because you never know what disputes can take place. It means all transactions need to be above board. As I mentioned a couple of weeks ago, you have countries like Indonesia, but there was no conquering Muslims that came to Indonesia. Indonesians became Muslims because they saw the character and the behavior and the mannerisms of the Arab Muslim traders who came and bought their cinnamon and their cloves and traded spices with them. It is only through that. It's through their character. If you are honest, you will then be able to, other people will see you in a very different light. In fact, on the way here, I was listening to one of the sermons, and they said this is when the Prophet was quite young. I think he was only about 12 or 14 years old. And the pagan Arabs were at that time rebuilding the Kaaba. And there was a dispute as to the black stone, what we call the black stone, who will move the black stone? Which tribe will have the authority or the opportunity to carry the black stone? So they could not agree amongst themselves. So they said, let's go to him. We'll go to him because he's the most fairest of persons. He's only a teenager and he'll decide for us. So he came up with a solution. And the solution was that the black stone was put on a big piece of cloth, and all the different tribes, they held the cloth. So they all said, we held the black stone. And then when the time came to place the black stone into the Kaaba, he was the one who actually picked up the black stone and put it in the Kaaba. So that kind of reputation is what we must try and emulate ourselves. Because in that way, you're not only creating a better space for you when you die, but you're also creating a lot of goodwill. And inshallah, God willing, that our behavior, the more we model it along the Prophet's lives, we'll be able to become better human beings. Those of you who are practicing Muslims will be able to become better Muslims. And indeed, we become better human beings. Because as, again, the Imam from Ba talked about Hart, who did an assessment of the 100 most influential people. And he did mention these aspects of the Prophet. So, ladies and gentlemen, I think these occasions, we celebrate this on an annual basis. The Speaker of the Fiji Muslim League said whether I'm going to talk about, we'll continue public holidays. Obviously, we will continue to do that. In fact, the history of why we have a public holiday for Prophet Muhammad's birthday is because before independence, when the different faith groups were asked which is the most important day for you to have a public holiday, of course for the Christians it was Easter, it was Christmas, the Hindus was Diwali, and the Muslims wanted Eid al-Fitr after Ramadan. But because Eid, you cannot set the date, because you cite the moon, so the next best thing where you could actually predict the date was the Prophet Muhammad's birthday. That's the history behind it. In the 2013 Constitution, every single faith in Fiji has the opportunity and the ability to practice their faith freely. Every faith-based organization has the opportunity to open their own schools, to have teachings based on their particular beliefs. And every person, irrespective of their belief, have the opportunity to participate in those schools. We are probably the only country in the entire South Pacific, Sheikh, for your information, that actually celebrates Hindu public holiday, Christian public holiday, and the Islamic public holiday. No other Pacific Island country does that. So we are very unique. And I think as Fijians, we must value that uniqueness. We must look after that uniqueness. We must also cherish that uniqueness. Because by participating in your country as equal citizens, which you now are, you'll be able to contribute not only to yourself, to your own self-well-being, self-development, but also be able to contribute as citizens to this wonderful nation of ours. I thank the organizers for the invitation this morning, and I wish you all a very good morning. Vinaka, thank you.